thought I would do today is first talk a little bit about the headline stuff and what's going on in Ukraine generally and where Ukraine might fit in the larger picture of things. And then talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing there, which can be kind of wonkish, but hopefully of interest. And I invite people, since we're such a small group, to ask me questions as we go along if things are unclear and so on. So this is the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Szalinski, 42 years old, born in Kryvyi Dnipropetrovsk Oblast in southeastern Ukraine, which is a primarily Russian-speaking area. His first language was Russian. He comes from a high socialist intelligentsia family. His father is the head of the computer science department at the University of Dnipropetrovsk, and his mother was an engineer. Both sides of the family suffered as victims of the Holocaust and as in the Red Army. He's a Jewish comic. He created a university-based comic troupe that became very popular and was popular both in Russia and throughout Ukraine. And 4 years ago, produced and starred in a TV sitcom in which he played a high school teacher who becomes president of Ukraine after his students put on the web a rant of his against how corrupt the country is. That sitcom was bankrolled in some sense by a Jewish oligarch from Dnipropetrovsk named Kolomoisky, who's a problematic character, but an interesting character in lots of ways. And then he's elected president in 2019 with 73% of the vote, which is kind of mind-blowing. And, you know, Ukraine has its fair share of anti-Semites and fascists, but for 73% of the population to vote for a Jewish comedian for president tells you something. We can talk about what in a bit.
What was turnout?
It was actually quite high. I think it was somewhere between 65 and 75%. It was not trivial. Oh, that's right. So, you know, there's our cast of characters, or a few of them anyway. Giuliani, Putin, and Trump. The people recognize the Vindman twins. Vindman twins are an interesting story, actually kind of personal anecdote, of which I'll have two. About 40 years ago, a good friend of my mother's, who was a photographer, was in Brooklyn and saw these two cute kids dressed in Navy suits and Yankee baseball caps and started taking pictures of them, and then realized that the mother was talking to them in Yiddish and began speaking to them in Yiddish. Well, those were the Vindman twins, who then went on through the public education system to go to Cornell and Harvard. One turned out to be the legal counsel for the White House, and the other turned out to be the chief specialist on Ukraine for the White House, until both ran afoul with Trump and were summarily dismissed after the impeachment trials. And there's Marie Yanovich, the former ambassador to Ukraine. So Ukraine is 3.8 million people. Without the 7 million people who are in Lugansk and Donetsk, that's a large chunk of the population. population has dropped from 52 million in around 1990 to 87, the last Soviet census. So it's fallen without the lost territories more than 10%. Largely because of demographic, I mean, about 50-50 between demographic decline, natural fall in the birth rate, and emigration. As a result, and one of the things that hasn't happened in Ukraine is any significant adjustment of the public sector, particularly health and education, to the decline in population. So it has hugely inefficient and ineffective health and education services, which are really, I think, we can talk a lot about why Ukraine has had so much trouble carrying out reforms that it's intended, but a lot of the reason is in the overstaffing of the public sector and the difficulties that it takes anywhere to restructure public sector employees. So, and I should say, well, actually, I'll go back. I meant to say this, which is, you know, the sitcom that Zelensky plays the president in is kind of straight out of Norman Lear. I mean, it looks like an American sitcom. It feels like an American sitcom. It is very clever. And it has him imagining, among other things, it has him imagining all the dilemmas of ruling Ukraine, including, you know, raising energy prices, firing people, negotiations with the IMF, run-ins with Putin, everything with the exception of anticipating the Trump story is sort of in the 3 seasons of this sitcom, which is available on Netflix. So if you're really interested, it's worth looking up and taking a look at it. But the fundamental dilemma in the sitcom is, how do we get out of a system in which everybody's first concern is, you know, with their own nepotistic possession of a position and using their connections to get something. So kind of very self-consciously thinking about, you know, what we need to do to break the cycle of corruption. You know, in a lot of ways, for a lot of reasons, you can take a very, like, nothing can seriously happen in Ukraine because Russia will use the occupation of Donetsk and Lugansk to poison the politics of the place for as long as possible. And it will use its control over gas supplies, which Ukraine needs in the same way. So there's an incredible, it's in some ways hard to see how Ukraine moves forward with this, and nobody has any brilliant ideas except by consolidating their own internal politics. And while Russia will be taking every possible potshot that it can as they go along. But there have been, the war really has crystallized something that you might call a Ukrainian national identity, which wasn't so sure that it existed 10 years ago, and probably not very clear that it existed 30 years ago. But, you know, Chernobyl was probably the first big impetus since the 1930s, and the occupation of Donetsk and Lugansk was kind of the second. The Ukrainian economy, I mean, it's a big, serious country with, you know, 5 or 6 cities of 1 million or more people. It is not, like many of the countries I've worked in, a one-city country. There are regional economies, regional differences. There's a distribution of power, even if lots of it, too much of it, resides in Ukraine. the population is pretty well educated. There are some very good in IT stuff, as we may know, and high-end metallurgy. There are some serious economic possibilities there. The economy has shifted pretty radically from being sort of 40% of trade going to Russia and 20% to the EU to 40% going to the EU and less than 20% going to Russia in 4 years. So, and there is more and more de facto integration with the European Union than the headlines suggest, mostly because of emigration and circular migration between Ukraine and Germany, first of all, Poland, second of all, and then a variety of other countries that are making liberal use of Ukrainian labor. So I'm going to talk particularly, maybe I take a few questions about the general situation if people have them. All right. I'm going to talk particularly about subnational governance reform in Ukraine, which has been an issue since at least the mid-90s. Once communism fell throughout Eastern Europe, everywhere there was a movement to create democratically elected local governments. In most countries, what that did was create, in most countries, the pattern is that previously collectivized farms in rural areas broke up into the memories of pre-war villages, and you get massive jurisdictional fragmentation. And that's true in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Ukraine. It's untrue in Poland because there wasn't collectivization, there wasn't this big of a counter movement, so you have larger first-level jurisdictions. So Ukraine created democratically elected governments with independence in the mid-1990s, but three fundamental problems were never really addressed. First was jurisdictional fragmentation. They allowed 12,000 villages to become first-tier local governments, and they couldn't support themselves and ended up having to live off transfers from the oblast, the regional and district levels, oblasts and rayons. In the mid-90s, they adopted a new constitution, and in that constitution, they defined rayons as an oblast. They called them oblasts, they called them local governments, but in fact, they were not. They had a democratically elected council, but all personnel was essentially named by higher level governments. So they were neither fish nor fowl. They took 150 cities and gave them democratically elected mayors and councils, so they're real local governments. But the oblast and rayon levels are neither fish nor fowl, and because of that, there's been a very unclear division of functions between state and local governments, states and municipal governments, particularly in rural areas of the country.
What would the average size of the village be?
Of the 12,000, about 500. 500 people, right. 2,500 is about, with 2,500 you can have a primary school. Kind of like, at that point you have enough people to have enough kids, to manage enough functions. So there have been a series of efforts in the 90s to strengthen the municipal foundations of the system. It was a big piece of the Orange Revolution. It then got completely pushed aside for various reasons. And the demand to continue with the local government reform was one of the central demands of Maidan. And immediately after the occupation of Lugansk and Donetsk, the newly elected president, Poroshenko, declared decentralization to be one of his government's major objectives. Now, how real that was is an interesting question, because what was going on is that much of our foreign policy elite was calling for the federalization of Ukraine as the only reasonable way to satisfy or to end the conflict with Russia. And the Ukrainians thought that was, and I think rightfully, the kiss of death, and came up with a response: we're not going to federalize, we're going to municipalize. So we're going to decentralize control to municipal level governments. We're not going to create regional parliaments that could pursue different agendas that might lead to the ultimate dissolution of the country or the breaking away of the eastern regions. So in part under pressure from external conditions, and in part as a continuation of the Maidan demands, the Poroshenko government says we're going to municipalize the system. This was not new, because this is what the Poles did for different reasons. But the Poles essentially created metropolitan cities with very far-reaching powers, and have been remarkably successful in doing that. So, and ironically, what the Poles were doing was based on what the Scandinavians did in the 1990s. So in the Nordic countries in the 1980s and 90s, there was a big drive to consolidate rural jurisdictions into larger units, create metropolitan areas, and then to decentralize what hitherto had been very centralized welfare states. So now, in Denmark, 60% of all public spending is done by subnational governments. In Sweden, it's about 50%. In Denmark and Sweden, local governments run, schools, the entire pre-university education, the entire medical system. Interestingly, they don't have single-payer systems. We'll get to that in a second. All elderly care, all network infrastructure. So, the lion's share of public spending is at the municipal level. The Poles looked at that and said, we want that. In fact, there were a bunch of Polish administrative lawyers and economists working in Scandinavia during the 1980s, really developing the plans. And when the Poles came in, when the wall came down, a bunch of people who had a pretty clear idea of what they wanted to do, and they built a kind of poor man's version of the Nordic system. Anyway, so Poroshenko reform comes in, and they make two key decisions. One is to move to a single-payer healthcare system. And that, in effect, means the re-centralization of at least the finances for the hospitals, which were run until then by oblasts in the big cities, some big cities, and the rayons in the rural areas. To amalgamate these 12,000 villages into 2,000 townships, and to reorganize the oblast and governing structures. Okay, so those were the kind of three pillars of the reform. And they've basically been taken on wholeheartedly by the Zelensky government, which is good. So there's a kind of continuation of the basic idea. That said, the Zelensky government has come in and in certain ministries kind of purged people who might not be such a good idea to purge, and in other ministries done the opposite. And there's a kind of culture war in the state bureaucracy between the 30-somethings and the 50, 60-somethings in most of the ministries. It's pretty striking. They've moved forward in ambulatory, with the single-payer system, and ambulatory health is now being financed on a per capita basis to private and public providers. In theory, next year, that should move to all hospitals. And this means that money that is currently going to local governments through a health grant will be taken away from them and used to pay for the single-payer contracting system. So local governments are going to actually lose money and lose control over the hospital system. The logic is that we can then use these monies to fund both private and public providers to provide services and create some competition in a system which is really terribly, terribly overstaffed and has some of the worst health outcomes in Europe, if not the world. I mean, the HIV rates, a lot of that happens to be actually in Donetsk and Lugansk. But HIV rates, measles rates, vaccination rates, they're all a disaster, or bad, though they have improved a little bit over the last few years. They initiated a voluntary process of allowing local government, rural jurisdictions to consolidate themselves, and they have incentivized this, and to date, over the last 3 years, about 50% of these 10,000, 12,000 villages have been formed into townships. So they're kind of halfway there. But they could never muster the parliamentary majority to do this by fiat until this year. So this year, they have enough of a parliamentary majority to say we're going to complete the amalgamation process countrywide, and we will have, first-tier local governments of reasonable size. Okay, so wait a minute, let me. Okay, then I was. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of segue into what my piece of this is, and that's really in the area of local government finance and what is known in the intergovernmental finance business as fiscal equalization. It's not a term that we're familiar with because America does almost none of it. In other words, fiscal and it is a term that most Europeans will recognize because most European countries have a system for providing poorer local governments with additional funds to provide public services. We do a little of this at the intrastate level, but with, Medicaid funding, and a little bit of this with the 10% of funding for schooling that comes out of the federal budget. And then at the state level, states do some equalization for school systems. But most European systems most European countries have specialized systems to provide additional funds to poorer jurisdictions. So America, we neither give much money to the poor, nor do we give much money to poor local governments to provide them with services. in European welfare states in general provide more money to the poor and more money to poorer local governments to provide services to them, which is interesting. On average, you know, this is a serious amount of money. It's 2.3% of GDP, and in most OECD countries without the US, or about 4 or 5% of total public spending. How equalization can happen in lots of different ways, so how this gets calculated is an issue, but in most of Europe, as I said, it's a serious undertaking. Ukraine, like many European countries, has an equalization system, and like the Nordic and the German and most of the post-communist world, that equalization system is keyed off the primary local government revenue. In most of Europe, the primary local government revenue is a share of the personal income tax generated in that jurisdiction. So if I live in a jurisdiction in Poland, I live in Warsaw, Warsaw gets 40% of my personal income tax, and the national government gets 60%. In Sweden, actually, the national government, 100% of the personal income tax goes to local governments. The national government sets the base and does the collection, but local governments set the rate, okay? In most of Europe, local governments don't have control over the rate. In some, they may be able to give a surcharge, but the major local government revenue is the personal income tax. Because the personal income tax is a pretty good reflection of the relative wealth of a jurisdiction and easy to calculate, it is then very easy to build an equalization system off that by saying, okay, if the average per capita yield for for people living, for the country as a whole is 100 units, and jurisdiction X only gets 50 units out of the personal income tax, the national government agrees to give an additional equalization grant equal to somewhere between 80 and 90%, 70 and 90% of the national average. In Poland, it would be then 85%. So you would get 85% of the difference between 50 and 100 per capita as a grant. It's very simple, very transparent, and works pretty well. The problem in Ukraine, however, is that the personal income tax, for historical reasons, is not registered by where taxpayers live, but by where the headquarters of the firms are in the public sector. And in the private sector, some of them are doing it by where people work, and some of them are doing it by the headquarters of the firms. Okay? That has a number of really serious problems for this system. Okay? What it says is we're giving money to local governments not because people live there or even that they work there, but because the headquarters of the firm is there. So it's inefficient, yeah.
Just to put that into context for a moment, is the personal income tax, is it collected by the companies?
No, it is I mean, they do, it's automatically, it's a payroll deduction, as it is here for most employees, right?
For most employees. So, in effect, I'm just thinking about if you're self-employed or in a farm in a rural area.
Agricultural workers aren't even included. That's another,
It's totally out. Okay.
unless they were working for a corporation, which there is now corporate agriculture in Ukraine in a fairly significant way, but yes.
And then trying to put again, this in a bigger context, where, if anywhere, does property tax or VAT fit
Okay.
in, because let's
Right.
just assume you're in a relatively prosperous municipal area.
Right.
And you own an apartment.
Right.
Do you pay property tax? Does anybody notice? And if you live out in the boondocks in a shed, does anybody notice? That kind of thing.
Okay, so I'm glad you wrote, the first thing is that the property tax in most of Europe is not a serious tax. In Anglo-Saxon countries, with the exception of England, it is, but it yields only 2.5% of GDP in the best of cases, right? Which means it doesn't do even what it was supposed to, designed to do anymore in America, which was to pay teachers' wages. I mean, that was the, but the short answer is, in Ukraine, they are trying to have a market-based property tax. It will take them 20 years to get there, if they ever get there. I mean, much of my life has been spent, you know, fighting the World Bank and USAID, who have dumped hundreds and millions of dollars into trying to make the property tax the be-all and end-all of local government finance. And it's very difficult to make happen, mostly because valuation is not an obvious thing. And, you know, putting in valuation systems and actually getting people to pay taxes for them it hasn't worked anywhere. So no, they're not getting money from the property tax is not a significant local government revenue. Land rents are, and some property transfer fees are. There's a sort of stamp tax when you sell or buy something that goes to local governments. That's a significant amount of money. Was there another? I think I forgot one piece.
The other one was the VAT, which
Okay, so,
countries-
right. I mean, and so, yes, now, again, America is completely anomalous in relying so much on the property tax to fund education and in not having a VAT. You cannot play ball in the international arena. You cannot, you know, borrow from the IMF now unless you have a VAT. So VAT, America is like the only country in the world of any consequence that doesn't have a VAT. And, you know, the dirty little secret of European welfare states, in large measure, is that they are largely funded. The central governments are using a regressive tax to fund universal social programs. And increasingly, what's happening in Europe is that the personal income tax is being ceded to metropolitan governments, while the consumption tax is being more and more the main funding for the national budget. So we're screwed up 6 ways to Sunday by those measures. So anyway, having the problem in Ukraine, one of the problems that we're dealing with in Ukraine is that, as I said, the pit is not allocated by place of residence. It's partially by headquarters of firm. So, for instance, the railroad and the post office, all of their pit money goes to Kiev, right? Despite the fact that they have employees nationwide. Nobody can tell us yet whether that's true of the national banks and other major firms that have employees across the country as a whole. So what the system currently does is overfunds the urban areas and underfunds the rural ones, and actually increases the need for equalization more than might otherwise be the case. And it makes no sense in the sense that it's sending money to jurisdictions in which people don't necessarily live, and therefore not funding the schools and the network infrastructure that they need. Moreover, and like many countries, Kiev operates under special rules. So not only is it getting too much out of the PIT system as it is, but it doesn't contribute to the equalization system at all. So most European equalization systems are funded partially, primarily, about 70–80% by the national government, with 20% coming from taxing richer jurisdictions and pushing the money to poorer jurisdictions. In Kiev at the moment, in Ukraine at the moment, about 35% of the funding is coming from the national budget, and 65% is being taxed away from richer jurisdictions, but not Kiev, the richest jurisdiction in the country. So arguably there, okay, well, and it's kind of outrageous because, Kiev has an investment rate double everybody else's, and because it's overfunded, it makes the least effort to collect its own revenues. So over the last 3 or 4 years, the city has only increased its collection of own revenues by 4%, whereas the other jurisdictions have increased it by, somewhere between 15 and 30. Another aspect of the system is that at the moment, for wonky technical reasons, they treat cities, rayons, and these new amalgamated units as if they had all the same revenue needs, and therefore they should all be equalized to the same level. So what's going on is that the rayons are being equalized to the same level as cities and these newly amalgamated units, despite the fact that rayons are losing functions and never were responsible for network infrastructure. So what's happening is that they're paying almost nothing into the system and getting the most out of it. And the big cities are paying the most into the system but are getting almost nothing out of it. And then to further complicate the situation, the system is very small. It's, if I said that on average in the OECD, it's 2.5% of GDP. Here it's 1/10 of that size, right? Yeah?
I'm trying to understand the political implications of what you just said. It sounds like the PIT is going into the center.
Right.
So in effect, the rural areas, the rayon, are subsidizing the cities. But then the cities are scarfing it, I won't say scarfing it back, but the fiscal equalization is pushing it back out. So I won't say that it's making it fairer, but I mean, it seems like money's going into the middle and then being churned and going back out, not equally, but there is just a churn.
Okay, so the first, yes, you've got the basic picture in the sense that more money than it should is going from rural and small towns, medium-sized towns into Kiev because of the headquarter of firm problem. And then when it gets redistributed, a disproportionate share of what's redistributed is going to these problematic rayons instead of these newly created townships. That's the way okay? So, what are we trying to do? okay, so and this is just a picture of it. So forget about the oblasts, which are done separately. But so in 218, you see 65 oblasts, I mean cities contributed to the equalization system, worth 3.3 billion hryvnia. 52 got money out of the system, but very little money. So they're net contributors, right? The rayons contribute very little. There are 45 that contribute, but 356 get, and they get four, so they're the net beneficiaries. And these newly formed amalgamated townships are getting more out of the system, but what we're arguing is not enough. So the total value of the system is about 8 billion hryvnia, which is less than 1%, well, less than 1.5% of total municipal revenues or local government revenues. So it's a very small piece of the system. And the national government is paying only for 3 billion of that 8. Okay? Is that sort of? So, you know, the fixing this, and this is kind of what I pretend to do long distance, is first changing how the tax administration registers the origin of PIT. And as we speak, there is a real food fight in the Ministry of Finance with the tax administration about putting in place procedures that would allow this to happen. Okay, and so this is an internal political fight or a bureaucratic fight within the Ministry of Finance. And, you know, the issue is, and this is not unique, the same issue I encountered in Colombia and in other countries, which is the amount of getting a bureaucracy to change its practices with respect to something as critical or as important as the registration of the personal income tax is a major fight, and there's always huge institutional resistance. That institutional resistance in Ukraine is compounded by the fact that many people are employed on minimum wage contracts and then receive additional payments in cash. So the large employers are a little wary of going to this because they think it will then be possible to identify how much of their workforce is and where their workforce is being paid these contracts against the law. Yeah.
Is that done to minimize social taxes?
Yeah, to minimize their costs, to lower their costs. So then, you know, as we said, the whole system is too small, and it's based too much on taxing away from really middle-income cities. So any movement forward requires shifting funds from other ministries and from other purposes into the equalization system. Now, one of the features of many countries that are famous for corruption is large amounts of money going through various ministries, through Parliament, to be spent on particular projects in particular places. So it sort of categorical grants and clientelism and patronage go together in lots of countries, and in Ukraine in particular. So there are now, by the EU's count, about 84 billion hryvnia in discretionary grants given by the national government to subnational governments. That's 10 times the amount of money that's in the equalization system, right? So, and some of those grants are legitimate, but there are lots of them that are, you know, sort of members of parliament control about 10 billion in grants that they can give out locally. So the Ministry of Finance recognizes that the equalization system has to be increased or should be increased, and also recognizes that these discretionary grants coming out of other ministries should be reduced, but the reform will require actually getting Parliament to do that. So it's the Ministry of Finance in this case against everybody else. I should add, I mean, actually, it's kind of the preface for all of this, which is in trying to convince Ukrainian politicians and technocrats and bureaucrats and local government officials that, you know, the equalization system has to be strengthened, the major argument has been that, you know, look, you're going through all this trouble to amalgamate 12,000 villages into townships, but just amalgamation isn't going to make them fiscally sustainable. Taking a bunch of poor areas and sticking them together ain't going to make them rich. So if you want these new jurisdictions to survive, you have to beef up this system, right? And, you know, we think that's understood, but we're up against a lot of resistance. And finally, any new system, whatever it does, will create winners and losers across local governments. And the big loser is likely to be Kiev. So you then have the capital city working against all of this. So that's the world I sometimes live in, and the jury is still out on whether any of this will happen, or some things will happen, I'm sure, but you know, how much of it will happen in the next year or 18 months. So I'll stop there and take questions if there are any.
How much of this is a legacy of the old Soviet substrate in a way? Because this all sounds like the landscape that you're walking through is the old Gosplan allocations, the detritus. In other words, it has a whiff of it. I don't mean to say it's still there, but just...
No. I mean, the old Soviet system is still there actually the piece of this that I didn't return to, in this unclear status of the oblasts and rayons. Okay, so the fact that the oblasts are called local governments, but in fact have their chief executives appointed by the national government, and most of the administrations are paid for by the national government, means that they're neither fish nor fowl. And a lot of the corruption and a lot of the corruption and a lot of the confusion about who's supposed to do what coheres at this regional level. So the regional oligarchs get themselves into the governor's office and run amok, or they're buying the governor's office and they're moving money around. There isn't really, there's not much central planning left in this, except that there are still people in the government that think that, you know, the rayons and the oblasts should be controlled centrally and their services run centrally. But that's not really the dominant force now. It's more breaking the existing interests to move to a system where democratically elected local governments are making more of these decisions than themselves. Does that help?
Yeah, I was thinking of it less of a planning thing as For instance, if you take the metallurgy folks, I wouldn't know, but I would guess that a lot of their plants and a lot of what they have is legacy assets.
Yes.
And the old system, I think, largely was designed to, shall we say, not unlike what happens in China and other places at the developmental stage, to move excess revenues from the farming sector into the industrial sector.
Okay.
And so you got that legacy lying there, and so when you look at where the headquarters are, maybe those are legacy locations.
Okay, so interestingly, the occupation, the heavy industry, the military-industrial complex was largely located in Lugansk and Donetsk. So in a funny way, I mean, if Ukrainian politicians could say, you want it, you've taken it, it's yours, we're going to forget about it, you do what you want to do with it, they would be a lot better off than this limbo land that they're in politically, because they can't, sort of renounce parts that were of the country that have been, historically part of Ukraine, at least for the last 60 or 80 years, right? So that, but a lot of the problem that you're talking about has, in a funny way, disappeared. There's still metallurgical industries elsewhere. They tend to be the higher end ones, more of the specialized production of stuff, not so much tied into, what's typically thought of as Rust Belt industries. Yeah.
I think at the beginning you mentioned the Zelensky claim for decentralization. Did I get that right?
Right.
If to me his intentions is a little ambiguous. Like Sims doesn't have a very clear idea exactly what to do. But why exactly he has to claim about decentralization in the first place? Can you give it more context?
Okay, so all right. So the first context is that for 30 years the Ukrainians have not been able to figure out whether regional governments and district governments in rural areas are state institutions or democratically elected local governments. And whatever way they went, whether it was centralizing them or decentralizing them, would probably be a better situation than the current confusion, okay? As I said, the Poroshenko government, there have always been local government reformers in Ukraine who've looked to Poland and said, we need to do what the Poles did and break the power of essentially regional bosses by creating a strong tier of first-level governments, okay? So in Poland, it was clear that decentralization meant municipalization. And that has been a feature of an aspiration of a certain group of Ukrainian reformers for 20 years. When Russia occupied Lugansk and Donetsk, as I said, much of Washington said, oh, the only way to solve this is to federalize the country. And the Poroshenko response was, no, we're not going to federalize, we're going to decentralize, meaning municipalize. The Zelensky government, and that's been fairly popular. I mean, it's been popular. Local governments in Ukraine are consistently, I mean, everywhere they're consistently rated higher than national governments in terms of trust and performance, but by massive margins in Ukraine. So those reforms have been relatively popular, and the Szalinski government decided, I think rightfully, to continue with them. Does that answer your question? I should also say that in part, they're violating it in the sense of at least the re-centralization of healthcare. So they're actually taking away control over hospitals from municipal governments and oblast and regional governments, which again I think is sort of a good thing as well. I mean, closing schools because you have, 3 kids in the school or 3 kids in a class is the problem from hell for local governments. They have to do a lot of the same thing with hospitals. So giving local governments 2 problems from hell to solve simultaneously, I think, is at least one too many. Yeah.
Just going back to Poland for a moment, what was the thinking when the Poles said, we look at Sweden and we want that? What was the logic behind that choice?
It's a very interesting story about which I've written some. Poland was a negotiated transition, and there was a set of discussions between the Communist Party and the Solidarity Union and experts called the Round Table Talks. And at those talks, the Communist Party offered democratic elections at the regional level, at a committee on local government affairs, which had actually been put in at the last minute. And in those discussions, the Solidarity leaders said, and these were administrative lawyers and economists, about a third of whom had been working with the Danes and the Swedes in the 80s. And they said, no way, Jose, that's too far away to have democratically elected local governments at the regional level. We're going to build this thing from the bottom up. If we want democracy to work, we start at the first level, and we want to put power at the bottom, not in the middle. And so they had a kind of coherent vision of what they were doing, and that was the model of this was coming out of Scandinavia, but they were doing it for different political reasons, which was that, late communism in all of these places really had a strong feature of kind of regional party fiefdoms doing whatever the hell they wanted. And the Solidarity folks were pretty conscious of this. Yeah.
This is a little less central to your talk, but you said at the beginning that occupation and war helped to crystallize the popular understanding of Ukraine as a multi-ethnic nation state whose future lies with the European Union. So, first of all, could you say why
I think.
And then secondly, and I've always been afraid to ask this question before, but I think I can ask it here. Is there anyone in Ukraine, any political group that proposes neutrality for Ukraine, like Austria after World War II, militarily, and as part of that vision of how it could join the EU, because Russia's never going to allow that as long as there's a threat to.
Okay, well, I mean, okay, so the answer to the first question is somewhat quixotic and, or my answer to the first question is somewhat quixotic and aspirational. But Ukraine is now a multilingual place in which the major dividing line is, are you with us or against us? Politically, right? And being with us, you can be a Jew, a Pole, a Hungarian, a Swabian, a Russian speaker. If you're with us, we don't care. right? So in that sense, there's kind of a Republican idea of what it means to be a Ukrainian now. And the folks that are out there who are appealing to a kind of Ukrainian identity that supposedly went back to, you know, the Kievan Rus are pretty marginal now. So that's, you know, how deep that runs, how much you can get off that, I don't know, but I mean, unlike, you don't see the rise of identity politics in Ukraine now. It's rather, and the fact that they could elect a Jewish comic with 73% of the vote sort of says to me that, you know, that's my proof of that, I guess. You know, part of the reason that Zelensky was appealing was that he did not take a hard line on Russia. And, you know, actually, one of the things that came up is that his comic group had performed for Putin and, you know, and played to large houses in Moscow until relatively recently. So part of, and he hasn't, you know, he's not been talking about joining NATO, and nobody is really talking about joining the EU officially, except like the EU has sort of basically done away with visa requirements for Ukrainians, right? And, you know, well, it'll be interesting to see the Germans in particular, meaning maybe, unfortunately, primarily Merkel, have been, you know, very engaged in trying to help the Ukrainians get it right, right? In
Visas, does that mean right to travel, or does it mean right to
Work legally.
In Germany, it's they're given work visas, and in Poland, you can't. I mean, you know, anybody who wants to set up a tech company and can claim the bona fides to do it will get a license. There are a couple of towns in Poland now that have, you know, Ukrainian-led tech firms. Radom is one, and there's another one that. So there are these clusters of that. So they can get work visas, and then a lot of it is just, you know, circular migration.
So how effective is Zelensky
Okay, so the short answer is not very, and at risk of losing more. Okay, so Zelensky was elected. He then dissolved parliament and did what Macron did, which is to call new elections and have his party, which is called, by the way, Servant of the People, the same as the TV show. And they won a constitutional majority in parliament. So theoretically, they have a constitutional majority, but half of their MPs, if not more, have no public service experience. You know, they're the local small businessmen or local teachers or who got elected. And he's made a bunch of moves that have, you know, so for instance, they couldn't decide upon what the constitutional amendment should be for the reorganization of oblasts and rayons. And they had a deadline. They gave themselves their own deadline of January 1 to get those through. And if they got those through, a lot of things would be a lot easier than they're going to be now. They died because they lost they couldn't muster the majority for them. And they're now in the process of trying to reformulate them and reconvene and see whether they can get them through. So, you know, on some levels, I mean, I think they've played the Trump thing perfectly, right? Which is, you know, they're very aware that the kiss of death will be if they lose bipartisan support, so they've refused to get engaged, and that's been very consistent through all pieces of the apparatus. On that, there's no problem. And we'll see how effective. I mean that's kind of what I'm living with. You know, how effective will they be? And it's very hard to tell what's going on in my domain. So, for instance, in this question about the constitutional amendments about oblasts and rayons. So one solution would be to say, well, rayons we don't really need that much. We'll make them into state administrations, and they'll run veterinary services and inspection services for the national government. And, you know, then the big question is, you know, are oblasts democratically elected governments or, again, territorial representatives of the national government? And, you know, in my mind, they could easily be territorial representatives of the national government. But doing that, saying that, requires going back on, you know, 30 years about having talked about them as local governments and aspirationally. So they won't do that. And then the other alternative of making them true democratically elected local governments, they haven't been able to do that either. And you don't know why, whether that's because they're honestly afraid of the dismemberment of the country and what independent local governments at the regional level would do, or whether you know, it's more a question they still want to appoint the guys because they don't have a political base, they're unsure of their own political base, and so it's hard to read the tea leaves on this. Some ministries seem to be very effective. Some of the 30-somethings that he's put in, the prime minister is pretty good. I mean, but it's probably too early to say. But they've lost some steam. They did a very stupid thing with Kiev over the summer, which was like, oh, yeah, Kiev is a problem, and we didn't win there entirely, so we're going to just take over the city government. And everybody went nuts, and they stopped. But it was 2 weeks of like, where did this come from? How did they come up with that idea? And going back, I mean, you know, one of the, you know, this is a Swedish-funded, Polish-run program whose major ally is the Germans. And, you know,
It's the Swedish organization.
Well, it's the Swedish Association of Local Governments, of local and regional authorities, which has a consulting wing. And that's who I work for, and that's paid for by CETA. But the agent within the EU that has been most concerned, I mean, the Swedes are very concerned for good reason, that has been pushing hardest for this has been the Germans, and particularly a personal emissary of Merkel's. And when she goes, it's not clear how much of the impetus will be there. And you could see I mean, there is a deep division in German politics about what kind of Ukraine they want or care for. And, you know, one half says, we don't give a damn so long as we can get the gas out of Russia, right? So it could be not so happy that way.
Is there ever any discussion of military neutrality, like Austria have to?
I mean, I think it's hard to talk about military neutrality when you're fighting a war and you're asking people for, you know, military hardware to right. But that I think is conceivable. I don't think that's off the table. But you see,
In exchange for getting those territories back, right?
you know, yeah, that's another thing. Do they really want them back? Yes. You know, Western Ukraine would happily see them go, right? They would say, you know,
What about multinational?
that's more ambiguous. But they don't. I don't think they want them without. I mean, the game that's going on is you know. The Russian position, which is hard to distinguish from the position of the people in Lugansk and Donetsk, is they should be reintegrated with lots of autonomy. Autonomy, right? And that was kind of the Minsk agreements, which are still out there. And that doesn't make sense too much. The other thing is that they are kind of a poison pill because they are the Rust Belt. They are the, you know, the regions with the highest levels of HIV infection, the highest levels of, you know, drug-resistant TB, all the social problems of despair were there well before the occupation. But yeah, I mean, I don't think the Ukrainians would be against neutrality. I think they want to be free to trade and join the EU if they could.
I just mean militarily.
Militarily, I think they would take that deal if it was a serious deal, but I don't see either side. I mean, I don't see the Russians
But Austria was the initiator. In fact, there was resistance by both the U.S. and the Soviets, but eventually they came to an agreement.
I mean, it's not. I don't know whether anybody is. One problem is embarrassingly, I do not read Ukrainian, so I don't. Outside of my little wonkish sphere, I'm not too aware of what these are going on. So I can't really say whether there's a foreign policy community that's pushing for that.
If I recall correctly, it was a week before the financial crash that George W. Bush said that they should be in NATO, after Putin had signaled to him, not a great idea.
Yeah, I mean, that was.
We've been pretty aggressive with people like Bolton and the like. I think until the U.S. is willing to consider it and publicly talk about it. And right now,
You couldn't do it.
right now we're insane. I mean, there's all this stuff, you can't even talk about the subject without going nuts. In this country.
Well, I mean, I think it would be hard for this country to put that issue on the table independently without at least a stable ceasefire. Right, you know, and.
It would have to come from Ukraine.
But you see, I mean, the problem is that the current state of affairs is just what, I mean, suits Putin and Russia suits Putin's Russia all too well, right? Because it gives them leverage over everything, just as it's done, you know, in the Transnistria or up with Moldova, and with Abkhazia in Georgia. It paralyzes domestic politics and gives you leverage over lots of things. So I'm not sure. I think the Russians really won't want much of a change in the status quo.
So leverage, is it leverage to accomplish something or just?
No, leverage just to,
It's gotta be a cost to it, Russia has.
yes, there, I mean, yes. I mean, and how, but they're treating, I mean, they're treating, my understanding is they're treating the populations of Donetsk and Lugansk horribly, and the number of people who are actually being given, you know, any sort of benefits or any sort of citizenship rights, is very small. So they're trying to limit their costs.
Are they effectively severed? I mean, my assumption is that, for instance, all of this sort of discussion, nobody even sends memos to to the other side. Or what I mean, is there any residual communication?
Yes, yeah, there is all sorts of, and the oligarchs are still passing stuff between, so that's there. All right, thank you. I'm sorry there weren't more people. If there are any other questions, happy to, but thank you for coming, and I hope it was interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right.